Hello everyone. Now we're going to talk about introductory to binding a character. Now binding is taking the character's joints and connecting them to the geometry. This is what's called a smooth binding. And in this process, we've just laid out our joints, so we want to do a test bind, which is just a quick version of bind to make sure the joints are actually moving the geometry properly, that they're positioned in the right location. So how do I bind a character? Well, we first want to go in and we have to select all the joints that are going to be connected to the geometry. Now we painstakingly went through and named these with the word bind on them. So I can go through and hold down command and just select each one of these. Now you'll notice that this is kind of tedious because I'm going through each area. Now we do have a couple areas where we can actually speed this process up. Up here, we can actually click and say select by name. And inside here, I can type in *_bind, and that should select all my binding joints. Star is a wildcard symbol for everything, and _bind has those. Now, if you misnamed your stuff, if you put uppercase B and lowercase b, then that complicates the problem onto it. So now I have all my joints selected, and now I'm going to shift select my geometry. So all the joints, then the geometry, and then we're going to go up into under rigging submenu, skin, and there's an area that says bind skin. We're going to go into the options for this. Okay. So by default, the bind to method is set to hierarchy. That means it's going to take one selected joint and it's going to take all the joints in there. So that includes the waist joints are going to be included in our bind, and we don't want that. So by far the most important process here is to click and say selected joints. The next one is going to be our bind method, and this is going to be the algorithm that chooses how the weighting is going to happen. Now, none of these are going to be perfect. They're all going to have different types of issues, and when we get to really finally binding our character later on in the month, we're going to go over, we're going to literally weight and do smooth weighting and things like this. This is pretty much just to get an initial weighting on here. So the other thing I normally do is I will turn maintain max influences. At this phase, it's not a real big issue because, like I said, we're not refining our weights here, but I'm going to click it off as well. Okay, so I'm going to hit bind. I'm going to undo this in a second because I want to show you how this algorithm is changing, because right now we're in closest distance. So I hit bind skinned, and now when I select my joints and I rotate it, you see that the character skin moves. Now you're probably saying, oh my God, look at that ear. Well, this is the distant mode. In distance, what it does is it radiates away outside of this joint and weights. So in other words, in this case, the fingers are going to be a disaster because these joints are going to radiate out and they're going to catch part of the other fingers like that. Okay, so I'm going to undo that. I'm just going to go back to the point where my geometry and joints are still selected. I go back into the bind skin options, and I'm going to switch to hierarchy. Now what hierarchy does is it actually weights based upon the joint hierarchies and goes through here. Now I might say, well, why don't I ever use distance? Well, sometimes if you have floating joints around the face, distance gives you a better weighting on that type of initial weighting. So I'm going to say apply on here, and now I'm going to put my joints down, and I'm going to see. And you can see that we still got verts in the ear moving, and our weighting is getting kind of crushed in our arm like that. But we're just kind of getting an idea of how things are moving around on here. Okay, so it looks like. Oh, that's right. I have controls in there. So ideally, we're just trying to see, is the motion actually working here? I'm going to go over the other two settings on here, and you can see how it's rotating around here. I'm going to turn my wireframe on shaded. That volume loss, that's fine. One of the hardest thing is to look at a test bind and just kind of ignore the stuff like these verts in the ears kind of going down. That's actually going to be a really easy thing to fix. And we're eventually going to come back to this and actually fix this in the next podcast. But right now we're just going over the different settings for the paint weight. So I'm going to undo that and bring and go back into our binding on here. Okay, so now we've got our geometry and joints selected again, and now I'm going to go down to heat map. Now what heat map does is it shoots ray traces out from our joints and uses those ray traces to determine. Now the dangerous thing with this, and including with the next one, which is geodesic voxeling, is that you can't have open areas of our geometry. It will not work. So this has to be a manifold piece of geometry. So I hit apply. And this one's taking a lot longer to calculate. There we go. And you can see this one's done a much better effect. We're still getting a lot of pinching in here, but I'm not really worried about that. As we can see, the influences are coming down here and they look pretty good. And you can see it's moving around properly. Now obviously that's a bad weighting, but I'm just looking at our influence there. That's actually really bad. Okay, and the final one I want to go over is the voxeling. Now this creates little voxels inside here that fill up the geometry, kind of like the ray tracing, and kind of go through. And this one can be some of the most accurate, but it's also the most time consuming to do. The calculation this one doesn't take very long after all. See, this one actually did not create a very good effect. You've still got some of the face in here. But those are just the 3 different settings. Different ones in different models will give you different algorithms on here. Ideally, since the heat map kind of gave me the best look right here, I'm just going to kind of stay with that one. And I'm going to leave that on here. I still have the joint selected. I have to select geometry. I hit apply. And that's where I'm going to stay with this, with the initial algorithm. Okay.